The night had fallen heavy and thick, wrapping the city in its cold, indifferent embrace. The streets, slick with a light rain, shimmered like glass under the pale glow of streetlights. It was a place of shadows, silent, distant, almost forgotten. Among these forgotten spaces, 4 children huddled together, seeking warmth in their close proximity. Their eyes flickered with exhaustion, but there was something else there too, a quiet, persistent spark of defiance. Luca, the oldest at just 12, had taken the role of the leader without anyone ever having asked him to. He was tall for his age, with a face that had already hardened from the weight of his experiences. His clothes, ragged and soaked through, clung to his body like a second skin. He kept watch, eyes darting from one end of the alley to the other. Beside him, Sarah shivered. Her small frame trembled, her blonde hair matted to her forehead. She looked younger than her 9 years, her wide blue eyes filled with a kind of sadness that no child should ever carry. In her hands, she clutched a tattered stuffed bear, its fabric worn and frayed. It was her only reminder of a time before the streets. Next to Sarah, Daniel leaned against the brick wall, his face buried in his arms. He was the quiet one, only 10, but already he had learned to keep his words close. He had stopped speaking much after the first few weeks on the streets. It hurt too much to say anything anymore. Finally, there was Emily, the youngest of them all. Only 8, but her big brown eyes told a story for older than her years. Her small hands were clasped tightly together, her legs pulled close to her chest as she tried to keep the cold at bay. The light from the street lamp cast long shadows across her face, making her look fragile, but there was strength behind those eyes. "Keep close," Luca muttered, his voice low but steady. "We stay here tonight. No moving unless it's necessary." The others nodded, the silence hanging thick between them, broken only by the distant sounds of city traffic and the occasional shout of a passerby too busy to notice them. The alley they had found was tucked away behind an abandoned building, its door long gone, leaving only a skeleton of brick and steel to stand guard. It wasn't much, but it was shelter at least for now. Sarah shifted, her teeth chattering. "Luca, I'm cold." Luca glanced down at her, his expression softening. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt warm himself, but he knew he had to keep it together. "I know, Sarah. We'll get through it. Just stay close, okay?" The others pressed in, creating a small, fragile circle of warmth. Luca scanned the street one last time before sinking down beside them. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. There were no scraps tonight, no food. They would have to wait until morning. "I hate it here," Daniel murmured, his voice muffled as he leaned back against the brick. Luca didn't respond at first. What could he say? It was hard to argue with the truth. The streets were cruel, unforgiving, and they hadn't given them any mercy. But Luca had learned long ago that hating the streets wouldn't make them go away. They were his only reality now. Sarah's voice broke the silence again, softer this time. Do you think things will get better?" Luca's heart tightened. He didn't know. He wanted to say yes, wanted to give her hope, but the truth was, they hadn't seen much in the way of kindness since they'd ended up here. The world was full of people who didn't care, who walked past them like they were invisible. But there was a glimmer, a sliver of something that made Luca hold on. "I don't know, Sarah, but we're together. We've made it this far, and that counts for something." For a moment, there was quiet again, save for the faint hum of the city in the distance. It wasn't much, but for the first time in weeks, it was enough. As the cold began to creep deeper into their bones, they leaned into each other, finding warmth not in the air, but in the quiet strength of their unity. Tomorrow would come, and with it, a new set of challenges. But tonight, they were here, and for now, that was enough. The morning light was a pale and timid visitor, creeping through the cracks of the buildings and casting a faint glow over the litter-strewn streets. The city had not changed overnight, and neither had their situation. But as the first rays of sunlight touched their skin, it brought with it the promise of a new day, one that would bring new dangers, new choices, and perhaps a chance for survival. Luca stirred first, his eyes snapping open, ever watchful. The others were still asleep, their small bodies huddled together for warmth. He had learned early on that the mornings were the most dangerous. People were already waking up, heading off to work, too busy to notice the 4 children curled in the corner of the alley. But those who did notice, they were never kind. Luca stood up slowly, trying not to wake the others. His legs ached, stiff from the uncomfortable sleep on the cold concrete. He stretched, his breath coming out in a fog as he looked around. The alley was empty for now, but that could change in an instant. He turned back to the others. Sarah was still hugging her bear, her tiny face buried in the stuffed animal as she slept. Daniel had curled into a tight ball, his knees drawn up to his chest. Emily, despite her small size, had managed to find a little space, her cheek resting against the wall, her dark curls messy but soft. He didn't want to leave them, but he knew they couldn't stay in this spot for long. Not with the police patrolling the streets more frequently. Not with the threat of violence hanging over their heads. They needed to move, to find somewhere safer to hide, somewhere they could scrounge together enough food to keep going. Luca reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the few coins he had left. It wasn't much, a few pennies, a nickel barely, enough to buy them any real food, but it was all they had. He turned back to face the others, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the path ahead would only get harder. But there was no turning back. They had made it this far, and if they wanted to survive, they would have to keep moving. Luca crouched down next to Sarah and gently shook her awake. "Sarah," he whispered softly, "we have to go." Sarah groggily blinked her eyes open, squinting against the light. "Where?" she asked, her voice thick. "With sleep. Anywhere but here," Luca replied. He reached for her hand and helped her to her feet. "Get up. We can't stay. Not in the open." Sarah nodded, still half asleep, but understanding the urgency in Luca's voice. She reached for her stuffed bear and hugged it tightly to her chest. Luca moved to wake Daniel next. The boy groaned when Luca shook him, but he slowly opened his eyes, recognizing the familiar worry in Luca's expression. "Time to move, Dan. You okay?" Luca asked quietly. Daniel didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, in his usual soft voice, he murmured, "Yeah." Finally, Luca turned to Emily, who was already stirring, her small hands rubbing her eyes. She was awake faster than the others, always alert, always on guard. She gave him a small, tired smile. "Let's go, Luca," she said. "I'm ready." They packed up what little they had, mostly scraps of old cloth, their shoes barely hanging together, and the few coins Luca had. As Luca glanced at the alley one last time, he could almost feel the weight of the world pressing down on them. There was so much they had to do, so many places they could go, but it was always the same, nothing but uncertainty ahead. They moved quickly, slipping out of the alley and into the streets. The city was just waking up, and it was easy to blend in with the crowds, just another set of invisible faces, blending into the rush of the city. But Luca wasn't naive enough to think they were safe. The city had a way of turning its back on people like them, of forgetting they even existed. As they walked, Luca's thoughts flickered to the path ahead. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be days without food, nights spent with their backs to the cold, and people who would look at them like they were nothing more than a nuisance. Still, Luca held on to one thing, the promise of tomorrow. Each day, each step, was a chance to find something better. As they reached the edge of the park, where the trees offered some shelter, Luca stopped, scanning the area. There were a few other kids huddled in the shadows, but no one seemed to notice them. He gave a small nod, signaling for them to keep moving, to stay quiet and out of sight. They moved toward the nearby subway entrance, where they could try to find shelter in the tunnels below. It wasn't ideal, but it was safer than staying out in the open. The subway was a dark, forgotten place, and they would have to be careful not to attract attention. But it was the only place that offered a brief escape from the dangers above. As they descended the steps into the underground world, Luca's heart pounded. The darkness swallowed them whole, and for a moment, he felt a familiar sense of fear creep up his spine. But as the others followed him, their small forms visible only in the faint light from the overhead bulbs, Luca reminded himself that they were not alone in this. Together, they were stronger. Together, they would survive. The journey was far from over, but this was a start, a hidden path away from the harsh world above, where they could take refuge, even if just for a while. The subway tunnels were eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city above and the occasional echo of footsteps. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete, stale water, and old decay. It was a far cry from the harsh brightness of the streets, and yet, in this darkness, the children found a strange kind of peace. Luca led the way, his every movement cautious, calculated. He knew the dangers of the underground homeless individuals, drunks, those looking for a fight, but it was the one place in the city where they could go unnoticed, if only for a while. The tunnels, cold and cavernous, had a way of swallowing people up, of hiding them in plain sight. For now, it would do. They found a small alcove near a train platform, tucked just out of sight from the main passage. It wasn't much, just a dry patch of concrete beneath a flickering light, but it was safe for the moment. Luca sat down first, his back pressed against the wall. He pulled his knees up to his chest, his mind racing with plans for the day. They needed food. They needed to find somewhere to sleep before nightfall. But most of all, they needed to stay off the radar. People didn't care about kids like them, and those who did usually weren't offering help. Sarah, tired from the walk, collapsed beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. She glanced up at him, her eyes full of silent questions. "Luca," she asked quietly, "do you think we'll ever have a home again?" The question hit Luca harder than he expected. He hadn't wanted to think about that, about what it would be like to have a place that felt like home. But Sarah had asked, and it was a question he couldn't avoid. "I don't know, Sarah," Luca murmured, his voice low. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also couldn't bear to crush her spirit. "But we're here now. We're together, and that matters." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she didn't speak again. She simply leaned against him, seeking comfort in the warmth of his presence. Luca knew the weight of their situation was wearing on her. She missed her mother, the way her arms had wrapped around her, the soft lullabies she used to sing. He had seen it in Sarah's eyes when she had first come to him, lost and alone, clutching that bear like it was her only lifeline. Daniel, sitting a few feet away, stared blankly ahead. His dark eyes reflected a deep sadness, one that had grown since they first ended up on the streets. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words carried a weight beyond his years. Today, though, he remained silent. Emily, ever the curious one, wandered to the edge of the alcove, peering into the darkness. Her tiny hand brushed against the rough brick wall, feeling for something, anything that might bring them hope. "Luca," she called softly, "do you think there are other kids here? Like us?" Luca's gaze followed her, his brow furrowing. He hadn't seen any others down here, but that didn't mean they weren't around. "Maybe," he said, standing up and crossing over to her. "But it's better we stay hidden for now. We can't trust anyone." The echo of footsteps suddenly startled them. Luca's heart raced. He motioned for everyone to be silent, his hand raised in a gesture of stillness. Sarah immediately curled up into a ball. Her body trembled. Daniel and Emily moved closer to him, their eyes wide with fear. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Luca's mind raced. There were only two options. They could stay here and risk being found, or they could move, slipping deeper into the tunnels. The latter option was dangerous. It could lead them straight into unfamiliar territory, but it was their best shot at survival. He whispered, "We move." Now they grabbed their belongings, barely anything at all, and made their way toward the shadowed hallway that led further into the depths of the subway system. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped. The sudden silence made the hairs on the back of Luca's neck stand up. He couldn't tell if the stranger had seen them or if they were just lucky, but they didn't wait to find out. They sprinted through the dark, the walls pressing in on them, the air growing heavier with each step. They didn't stop until the sounds of the footsteps were far behind them, swallowed by the distance. In the dim light of the tunnels, Luca turned to check on the others. Everyone was there. "Are we okay?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Luca gave her a reassuring nod, though inside, his heart pounded with the uncertainty of their situation. He didn't know what awaited them in the next few hours or days, but he did know one thing: they couldn't keep running forever. They needed to find something, anything, that would give them stability. The tunnels stretched out before them, like an endless maze, the walls lined with graffiti, dirt, and old forgotten things. Luca felt the weight of their future pressing down on him more than ever. They couldn't keep living like this, hiding in the shadows. Sooner or later, they would have to face the world above. But for now, They were safe. For now, they had each other. The tunnels stretched out like veins through the city, dark and winding, with no clear end in sight. The faint hum of distant trains reverberated through the walls, but the deeper they went, the quieter it became, as though the world above had disappeared entirely. It was both a blessing and a curse. Luca led the way, his footsteps echoing softly against the damp concrete. The air was musty and thick with the smell of rust and mold, but it was familiar now, a temporary refuge from the dangers above. They had been walking for hours, their small feet dragging as exhaustion took its toll. But Luca couldn't afford to stop. They couldn't afford to stop. He glanced back at the others. Sarah was clinging to her stuffed bear, her face pale with fatigue. Daniel moved in silence, his hands jammed into his pockets, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Emily, despite her small size, had been the most energetic, darting around corners and peering down dark passages with wide, curious eyes. But even she was slowing down now, her little body struggling to keep up. "Luca," Sarah murmured, her voice weak. "How much farther?" Luca hesitated. He didn't have an answer. He had no idea how far they'd gone or where they were. The tunnels were a labyrinth, and each turn felt like they were just circling deeper into the unknown. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we can't stop. Not yet. We need to find somewhere safe." Sarah didn't reply, but her tired eyes said it all. She was scared, and she had every right to be. The world above had shown them nothing but cruelty, and now, in the dark, they were left to fend for themselves. But Luca had promised that he would keep them safe, and somehow, no matter how lost they got, he was determined to keep that promise. They walked for what felt like hours more, the darkness pressing in around them. Every step seemed heavier than the last. Luca was exhausted physically and emotionally. His mind kept drifting back to the others, to their faces, their pain. But he couldn't afford to get lost in his thoughts. He had to focus on the here and now. "Stop." Daniel's quiet voice broke through his thoughts. Luca looked up, startled, but Daniel was already looking ahead. His dark eyes narrowed, and his lips parted slightly, as if he were sensing something they couldn't see. "What is it?" Luca asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. Luca followed, glancing at the others to make sure they were with him. Sarah was still clutching her bear, and Emily, despite her exhaustion, was close behind. Then, Luca saw a faint glow coming from up ahead. It wasn't much, just a dim light at the far end of the tunnel. But it was enough to make his heart skip a beat. It was a sign. There was something ahead, maybe safety, maybe danger, but it was something. Luca motioned for the others to follow and moved toward the light, his senses on high alert. The closer they got, the clearer the sound of voices became, soft murmurs at first, then clearer, more distinct. Luca's heart pounded. Who else was down here? Were they friends or enemies? They reached the source of the light, and Luca stopped, his body tense. What he saw made his stomach drop. A group of older kids, maybe a dozen, had gathered around a small fire. They were sitting on crates, barrels, and pieces of scrap wood, talking in low voices. The flickering fire cast an eerie glow on their faces, making them look older, harder than they should have been. Their clothes were even more ragged than Luca's group's, their faces etched with the kind of weariness only the streets could create. Luca froze, unsure of what to do. The others were still a few steps behind, waiting for his lead. "Should we leave?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "No," Luca replied quietly, though he wasn't sure himself. "We can't keep running. We need to know if they can help us." His voice was shaky, but the decision had already been made. They couldn't go on without food, without some sort of support. They had to take a risk. Luca took a deep breath and stepped forward, leading the others closer to the fire. As they drew near, one of the older kids, a girl with short, unkempt hair and a hardened look, noticed them. Her eyes flicked over the group, sizing them up in an instant. "Hey," she called, her voice rough. "What do you want?" Luca's heart pounded in his chest. "We were just looking for a place to rest. We didn't mean to intrude." The girl's gaze softened slightly, though her suspicion remained. She nodded toward the fire. "You can sit, but don't get too comfortable. People don't stay long down here." Luca hesitated, then nodded. He motioned for the others to join him, and they sat down near the fire, careful not to get too close to the older kids. The warmth was a welcome relief, but it didn't ease the tension in Luca's chest. He watched the older kids closely, trying to get a sense of whether they were allies or threats. The girl who had spoken earlier leaned over, her eyes narrowing as she studied them. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, her voice colder now. Luca's mind raced. He could lie, say they were from another part of the city, but something about the way the girl looked at him told him she wouldn't fall for it. "No," he said quietly, "we're just trying to survive." The girl seemed to consider this for a moment before shrugging. "You'll learn," she said, her voice distant. "The city doesn't care about you. Down here, it's every kid for themselves." Luca nodded, knowing all too well what she meant. He didn't respond, but the weight of her words sank deep into his chest. The streets, the tunnels, they didn't care. And in a way, that truth was both comforting and terrifying. For now, they had found a temporary refuge. But Luca knew deep down that they couldn't stay here forever. One day, they would have to face the world again. And when that day came, they would be ready. The warmth from the fire didn't last long. As soon as the last flicker of daylight disappeared, the chill of the underground settled in, wrapping itself around their bones like an old, uninvited friend. The older kids, most of whom had hardly acknowledged Luca's group, continued to talk in hushed tones, their conversations peppered with quiet laughs and occasional sharp words. The tension in the air was thick, a constant reminder that, down here, nothing came for free. Luca sat near the fire, his back against a jagged piece of metal that protruded from the concrete wall. His body was stiff from the walk, his stomach growling with the familiar emptiness. But he didn't let it show. He had to be strong for Sarah, Daniel, and Emily. Sarah was already asleep, her small body curled up beside Luca's leg. Her stuffed bear was tucked tightly under her arm, a small semblance of comfort in a world that had stripped away everything she once knew. Daniel, however, sat a little farther away, his face unreadable as he stared into the fire. Emily, as always, was moving restlessly, her eyes wide as she took in the scene around her. Luca glanced up at the girl who had spoken to them earlier, still watching them with cold, calculating eyes. She had moved closer to the fire now, sitting across from him, her legs stretched out in front of her. Her name, Luca had learned, was Leah. She didn't seem interested in conversation, but the way she was looking at him made it clear she was sizing him up. Leah finally broke the silence, her voice low but steady. "You don't look like you belong here. You're too soft." Luca clenched his jaw, unwilling to reveal too much. "What do you mean? You're too clean. Not enough." "Scars," she said, her gaze flicking to his face. "You don't know how to survive down here." Luca's fists tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "We've survived just fine." Leah studied him for a moment longer, as if weighing his words. Then she shrugged. "We all have our price to pay, sooner or later." She gestured vaguely toward the rest of the group of kids. "This place, it changes you. If you want to stay, you'll learn the rules. And the first rule is simple. Survival means doing what you have to do." Luca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He understood what she was saying, but the thought of doing whatever it took to survive, no matter the cost, made his stomach churn. He looked over at the other kids around the fire. Most of them were older, hardened by the streets, their eyes deadened by experiences Luca couldn't begin to imagine. "We don't want trouble," Luca said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "We're just trying to stay safe." Leah's lips curled into a half smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Safe?" she scoffed. "There's no safe here. Not anymore. The city's out to get all of us. And the only way to stay one step ahead is to take what you can get, when you can get it." Luca stayed quiet, unsure of how to respond. He wanted to ask more, to understand exactly what she meant, but he knew better than to press. If Leah was offering any advice, it was likely laced with the bitter truth of survival in a world that didn't care. The air grew colder. As the night dragged on, and the sounds of the city above seemed to fade away, swallowed by the concrete and stone, Luca couldn't remember the last time he had slept without fear gnawing at his insides. He longed for a night of peaceful rest, a time when he didn't have to be on edge, but he knew that wouldn't come until they found something more permanent, something better. The thought of finding something better, anything that resembled a place to call home, was a constant ache in his chest. Something that wouldn't go away. They needed food, they needed warmth, and they needed stability. And that meant navigating a world full of danger. "Luca," Emily whispered. Her small voice trembled. He looked down at her, and for a moment, their eyes met in shared understanding. She was scared, just like him. They all were. "What's wrong?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer. "I don't want to stay here," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "It's too dark, too dangerous." Luca's heart ached. He didn't want to be here either, but they had no choice. Not yet. "We'll leave when it's safer, Emily," Luca promised, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "We're together. That's all that matters." Emily nodded, though her eyes were filled with uncertainty. "I miss Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. Luca's throat tightened. He missed his mother too, though he couldn't remember much of her. He had been so young when she left. But Emily, with her bright eyes and her broken heart, reminded him of what he had lost and what he was fighting for. Suddenly, the sound of a metal grate scraping against the floor snapped Luca's attention back to the fire. Leah had stood up, her eyes scanning the group. The others were starting to stir, looking toward her in silence. "You're not the only ones down here," she said, her voice flat. "There's always someone looking for an easy target. And you're an easy target." Luca felt a cold rush of fear wash over him, but he didn't flinch. He had seen enough to know that the world was full of people who would take what they could, without hesitation. They couldn't afford to be weak. "What do you want from us?" Luca asked, his voice steady. Leah's eyes flicked to the fire, the flames reflecting in her gaze. "I don't want anything, but if you want to survive, you'll need to make your own way. And that might mean taking what you can get." Luca's mind raced. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. The price of survival was more than just fighting for food or shelter. It was about holding on to what was left of their humanity. But was that even possible down here? As the night grew colder, Luca's thoughts swirled. They couldn't stay here forever. Sooner or later, they would need to face the streets again. They would need to find a way out of this dark, suffocating place and find hope, no matter how elusive it seemed. The air in the tunnels grew heavier with every passing minute, thick with the scent of metal and earth. Luca sat quietly, his thoughts a tangled mess as he tried to piece together what Leah had said. The older kids around the fire were growing restless, murmuring among themselves, their eyes flicking between Luca's group and the flickering flames. Sarah had fallen asleep in Luca's lap, her breath warm against his skin. Daniel sat beside him, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze distant as he stared into the shadows. Emily, ever the restless one, was shifting, uncomfortably beside them, her small hands gripping her stuffed bear like it was a lifeline. Luca's eyes were fixed on Leah, who was now standing a few paces away, her back to the fire as she surveyed the group. There was something about her, something cold and calculating, that made Luca uneasy. She had offered them a temporary refuge, but Luca couldn't shake the feeling that there was a cost, one they would have to pay sooner or later. "You should keep an eye on your stuff," Leah said abruptly, turning her head to speak to him, her voice as sharp as the crackling fire. "Down here, no one gives anything for free." Luca's heart skipped. The warning was clear, and it didn't sit well with him. They had barely anything as it was, just a few coins, the scraps of food they'd managed to find, and their worn-out belongings. But it didn't matter. They weren't the ones who needed to be careful. They were the ones who needed help. He swallowed the uneasy feeling in his chest. "We're not here to cause trouble," Luca said, trying to keep his voice steady. Leah turned to look at him, her eyes dark and calculating. "Trouble follows kids like you. Innocent and too trusting. You think the city cares about you? About anyone like you?" Luca wanted to say more, to argue, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Leah wasn't here to offer advice. She was here to survive. And if it meant using them, Luca could already see she would. The tension between them was thick, and Luca felt the weight of her words, pressing into him like a physical force. He didn't want to trust her, but trust was something he couldn't afford to waste, especially in a place like this. Survival meant walking a fine line between protecting yourself and keeping whatever humanity you could. Sarah stirred in his lap, her small body twitching as the cold crept into her bones. She opened her eyes, blinking sleepily, and looked around the group. When her gaze met Lucas, she gave him a small, tired smile. "I'm hungry," she murmured softly. Luca nodded, his throat tight. He had nothing to give her. The small scrap of bread they had eaten yesterday was long gone, and the few coins they had left wouldn't get them far. "I know, Sarah," Luca whispered, brushing a strand of her hair from her face. "We'll find something, I promise." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. The tunnels were filled with danger, and even though they had found shelter for the night, tomorrow they would have to leave, move on, keep going, because staying in one place was a risk. Leah's voice cut through his thoughts. "You think you're the only ones hungry down here?" She turned her head toward one of the older boys who had been sitting quietly by the fire. He was tall, with shaggy hair and a hardened expression, and he had been eyeing the children with growing interest. Luca felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What was Leah planning? The boy stood up slowly, deliberately, and walked toward them. His eyes never left Luca's as he crouched down in front of them, his hands in his pockets. Luca tensed. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low but firm. The boy grinned, a flash of something dangerous in his eyes. "Food," he said simply, his voice gravelly. "You're hungry. We're hungry. Everybody's hungry." Luca's mind raced. Was this some kind of test? Or was this just the beginning of something worse? "We don't have much," Luca said, trying to keep calm. "We don't want trouble." "Trouble?" The boy laughed darkly. "Trouble's what happens when you don't give, when you don't share what little you have." He took a step closer, his eyes glinting with the promise of something more sinister. "But we can work something out. I'll help you. You help me." Luca felt a surge of anger, but he tamped it down. They needed to think their way out of this. Violence would only bring more enemies, more danger. "What do you want from us?" Luca asked again, his voice firm, but the knot in his chest tightening with every passing second. The boy didn't answer immediately. He stood there, staring at Luca before his gaze flicked over to the others. "I've got friends down here, people who can get you what you need." He paused, as if savoring the moment. "But you've got to pay the price." Luca clenched his fists, his heart racing. What price could he possibly pay? They didn't have anything left to give. He glanced at Sarah, at Daniel, at Emily. He couldn't afford to lose them. Not now. "What's the price?" Luca asked, though he was afraid of hearing the answer. The boy's grin widened. "You don't have much, but I'm sure you'll figure something out." Luca's mind raced. This wasn't just about food. It was about something else, something deeper. Survival in the tunnels was more than just finding shelter or food. It was about power, about making deals, and about what you were willing to sacrifice. Luca knew he was running out of options. He couldn't trust this boy, couldn't trust anyone down here. But he also knew they couldn't leave empty-handed, not after everything they had been through. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "What's the deal?" he asked, his voice quiet but resolute. The boy leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale smoke. "Help me, and I'll help you. Don't, and you'll regret it. But I'm sure you'll make the right choice. It's all about survival, right?" Luca's heart pounded in his chest. The cost of trust was more than he had bargained for. And as he looked down at the faces of the children who had placed their lives in his hands, Luca realized something. Survival didn't just mean fighting the world around you. It also meant holding on to whatever piece of yourself you could, even when it seemed like everything else was slipping away. The silence that followed the boy's words was thick, heavy with an uncertainty Luca couldn't shake. His heart beat loudly in his ears, the tension crawling under his skin like an itch he couldn't reach. The boy whose name Luca had learned was Jock stood in front of them, waiting for a response. Behind Luca, the group remained still, their eyes wide, anticipating his decision. Luca took a deep breath, trying to steady the panic bubbling in his chest. His mind raced with the options, none of them good. If he agreed to whatever Jocks wanted, what price would they have to pay? What kind of choices would they have to make to stay alive in a world that seemed bent on breaking them? If he refused, would they be left to starve in these tunnels, vulnerable to whatever dangers lurked in the shadows? The The weight of the decision pressed heavily on him. He was only 12. He shouldn't have to make these choices. But here he was, standing between his group and a world that seemed to take from them at every turn. Jocks' grin widened as he noticed Luca's hesitation. You want food, don't you? You want to survive? Well, you have to pay the price. I can get you food, but nothing's free down here. You have to decide. Are you going to take what I'm offering or walk away hungry? Luca's mind flashed to the few coins in his pocket, the rags they wore, the empty stomachs. Sarah's sleepy face, still clutching her bear, haunted him. Emily's small hands, trembling slightly from the cold. Daniel's blank stare, the quiet hurt he'd learned to mask so well. He couldn't let them go hungry again, not after everything. But the way Jocks spoke, the arrogance in his tone, the implied threat behind every word left a bitter taste in Luca's mouth. It felt like a trap, a dangerous deal with someone who didn't have their best interests at heart. He glanced at his group. Sarah had fallen asleep again, her head resting against his leg. Daniel was watching Jocks closely, his eyes narrowed, sensing the same danger Luca felt. Emily, on the other hand, was looking down at her stuffed bear, clutching it tightly to her chest. She was too young to understand the full weight of the situation, but she could sense the tension, the fear. Luca clenched his fists, the knuckles white from the pressure. He had to protect them, but at what cost? We don't want trouble, Luca said finally, his voice low and firm. We just need food. We don't need anyone else's business. Jocks' expression hardened at Luca's defiance. You don't get to make the rules here, kid. You're in my territory now. So, if you want food, you play by my rules. He took a step forward, looming over Luca. You need to learn how things work down here. You don't have a choice. Luca's stomach twisted. He had been hoping for a way out, a way to avoid this confrontation, but it was clear that wasn't going to happen. The darkness around them seemed to close in, the firelight flickering as if it too was uncertain of what came next. I'll make you a deal, Jocks continued, his voice turning cold, calculating. Help me with something, a small job. Nothing too dangerous, I promise. You help me out, and I'll make sure you get food. I'll even throw in some supplies. Luca felt a shiver run down his spine. A job? What did that mean? The last thing he wanted was to get involved in whatever shady dealings Jocks was offering, but his mind kept returning to the same cold thought. They couldn't survive down here without help. The harsh reality of their situation settled in. Luca's eyes flicked to the others. Daniel was watching him, silently urging him to make the right decision. Emily clutched her bear tighter, her face full of quiet fear. And Sarah, so young, so innocent, was still curled up against him, unaware of the danger they were in. Luca took another breath, trying to steel himself. This was a decision that could change everything, but no matter how much he hated it, he knew they needed food. They needed to survive. All right, Luca said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. What's the job? Jocks' grin returned, this time with an almost predatory gleam in his eyes. That's more like it, he said, crouching down beside Luca. You're gonna help me with a little trade. There's a guy a few tunnels down who owes me something. I need you to go and get it. Simple, right? Luca felt a cold knot in his stomach. A trade? What kind of trade? He didn't trust Jocks, didn't trust anyone down here. But the alternative was going hungry, and he couldn't let that happen to Sarah, to Emily, or to Daniel. They had already lost so much. What do you want us to do? Luca asked, his voice quieter now. Jocks leaned in close, his eyes gleaming with something dangerous. Just get the package, bring it back. Don't ask questions, and don't get caught. Luca hesitated. What's in the package? Jocks' grin grew wider. Doesn't matter. It's not your concern. You do your part, I do mine. We all walk away happy. Luca swallowed, trying to suppress the rising dread. This wasn't what he had wanted, but sometimes survival meant doing things you didn't want to do. Sometimes it meant making deals with the devil, just to get by. He nodded, slowly. All right, we'll do it. Jocks straightened up, his expression shifting back to one of satisfaction. Good. I'll give you directions, and I expect you to get it done tonight. If you mess this up, I'll make sure you regret it. You got that? Luca nodded again, his throat dry. I got it. Jocks clapped his hands together, his eyes gleaming. Perfect. Now, get some rest. You'll need it for the job. And remember, you'll owe me too. Don't forget that. As Jacques walked back to his group, Luca felt the weight of his decision settle over him. It wasn't the choice he had hoped to make, but it was the only choice he had. As the fire crackled in the background, Luca looked down at the others. Sarah was asleep, her breath soft and steady. Emily and Daniel were still awake, the uncertainty in their eyes reflecting his own. They had no idea what was coming next, but Luca knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The tunnels had never felt so cold. Luca could feel the chill creeping into his bones, gnawing at his insides. It wasn't just the physical cold, the kind that seeped into your skin and froze your fingers. It was something deeper, something heavier. It was the weight of the choice he had made, the price they had just agreed to pay. Sarah, still clutching her stuffed bear, was nestled against him, her small frame barely visible in the darkness. Her soft breathing was a comforting rhythm, but Luca couldn't shake the anxiety clawing at his chest. Emily sat next to him, her face pale in the firelight, her eyes wide and full of question. Daniel, as always, said nothing, his face hidden in the shadows as he stared ahead. Luca had told them little about the job they had agreed to. He hadn't wanted to explain. He hadn't wanted them to know just how desperate they had become, how close they were to falling apart. But they would find out soon enough. They would see for themselves what kind of world they were now in, a world where survival meant making deals with people who didn't care about anything but themselves. As Jacques' group settled in for the night, Luca glanced at the others, trying to gauge their reactions. Sarah was asleep now, her body curled into a tiny ball for warmth. Emily, though exhausted, was still awake, her wide eyes watching Luca with an intensity that made him feel uneasy. Daniel was still silent, but Luca could feel the tension in him, the same way he felt it in himself. The weight of what was coming, the uncertain future ahead of them. It was too much to carry alone. "I'm sorry," Luca whispered to no one in particular, his voice barely audible. "I didn't want to put us in this position. I thought it would be different." Emily looked up at him, her expression gentle, despite the fear she wore on her face. "You're doing the best you can, Luca," she said softly. "We're still together. That's what matters." Luca gave her a weak smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Together, that was the one thing he held on to. But would it be enough? The tunnel around them felt like a world away from the city above, from the lives they had lost. The flickering firelight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the darkness feel even more oppressive. The constant drip of water from above echoed through the passage, like an endless reminder of the cold world they now inhabited. Luca stood up, brushing off the dirt from his pants. "We'll leave soon," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Stay close to me, and don't talk to anyone. We don't know who's out there." The others nodded, though Luca could see the unease in their eyes. They knew. They had learned, just as he had, that trust was something you couldn't afford on the streets. Not anymore. Luca's mind was spinning with the implications of the job. Jacques hadn't given him much to go on, just vague instructions about a package and a warning to keep their mouths shut. But Luca knew better than to take those words at face value. Jacques didn't care about them. He saw them as nothing more than tools, pawns in a game they didn't understand. As the fire slowly died down, Luca motioned for the group to follow him. "Stay quiet and stay alert." They made their way through the dark tunnel, their footsteps muffled by the wet floor. The distant sound of the trains above them grew louder as they moved deeper, the low rumble vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. The air was thick with the smell of rust and dampness, and Luca's stomach twisted with the realization that they were moving further into the unknown. At first, the journey was quiet, the sound of their footsteps the only noise that broke the stillness. But as they reached a narrow junction in the tunnel, Luca heard voices ahead. Low murmurs, the kind that could be easily missed if you weren't listening closely. Luca stopped, signaling for the others to crouch down in the shadows. He peered around the corner, his heart pounding in his chest. There, at the far end of the tunnel, a group of older kids was gathered around something. Their voices were muffled, but Luca could hear enough to make out a few words: angry, sharp, and full of hostility. Luca didn't know what they were doing, but whatever it was, It wasn't good. He motioned for the others to stay back and began to inch forward, his breath shallow as he moved closer. He couldn't risk being seen. Not yet. He could see the package, now small, wrapped in what looked like a dirty cloth, resting on the ground between two of the kids. It was almost too easy. Luca's instincts screamed at him to turn around, to back away before they were caught in something they couldn't get out of. But they were hungry. They needed that package. He needed to get it. He waited for a moment, watching the group, looking for any sign that they might be distracted. The older kids were talking, laughing, one of them slapping the others on the back as they joked about something Luca couldn't hear. It was the perfect moment. Luca glanced back at the others. "Stay here," he whispered, urgent. "I'll be back in a minute." Before they could protest, Luca took a deep breath and stepped forward. His feet were silent against the wet concrete. His body pressed low against the walls of the tunnel as he moved closer to the group. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he focused on the task ahead. He had to get the package. He had to bring it back, no matter what it took. He reached the package and bent down to grab it. His hands trembled. He couldn't let them hear him. He couldn't let them see him. As his fingers closed around the cloth, the noise from behind him stopped. Someone had seen him. Luca froze, his body tense as he slowly turned to face the group. The older kids were staring at him, their eyes narrowing as they realized what he had done. The tension in the air was immediate, crackling like electricity. "Hey," one of them shouted, stepping forward. "What do you think you're doing?" Luca's pulse quickened, but he didn't let his fear show. He stood up straight, gripping the package tightly. His voice came out stronger than he expected. "I'm just taking what's mine." The older kid sneered, his fists clenching. "That's not how this works, kid." The rest of the group started to move, and Luca's heart skipped a beat. They were closing in on him. He had to get back to the others. "Stay calm. You can do this." Before they could reach him, Luca turned and bolted, the sound of pounding, footsteps chasing after him. He heard a shout from behind, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He ran, the weight of the package in his hands, his breath ragged and desperate. The others would be waiting. He had to make it back to them. And whatever happened next, he wouldn't back down. Luca's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as he sprinted down the tunnel, his feet pounding against the wet ground, the heavy thud of footsteps behind him growing louder. The package was clutched tightly in his hands, the rough cloth digging into his skin. He couldn't afford to slow down, not now, not when they were so close. The echo of his heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything except the fear that surged through him. He could hear the older kids behind him, their voices growing louder, angrier. They were gaining on him. His thoughts flashed to the others. Sarah, Daniel, Emily, they were waiting for him, trusting him to bring back what they needed. He couldn't let them down. Not now, not after everything they had been through. Luca's legs burned with the effort, but he pushed himself harder, faster. The tunnel stretched out in front of him, dark and unyielding, the distant sound of the trains overhead rattling through the ground. The light from the fire was still behind him, but it was fading fast, swallowed by the darkness of the tunnel. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. He glanced over his shoulder just for a split second, but it was enough to see the first kid, a boy with a cruel smirk, closing in on him. Luca's heart skipped. They were right there. "You can't stop now. Keep running. Keep going." He turned his focus back to the tunnel ahead, his mind racing. There was no escape. The city was a maze, but there was no way out of this chase unless he outran them. And Luca knew he was faster than most kids his age, but there was no telling how many of them were after him. They would stop at nothing. Suddenly, a shout rang out from behind him, followed by a loud crash. The boy chasing him had tripped, and Luca's heart surged. For a moment, he thought he might actually make it. But then, a voice from ahead broke his hope. "Where do you think you're going?" Luca's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't from behind him. It was ahead of him, blocking his path. He skidded to a halt, his shoes slipping on the wet floor, just in time to see a tall figure step out of the shadows. It was another one of the older kids, this time a girl, with a scar across her cheek and a look that screamed danger. Her eyes flicked to the package in his hands, then back to him. She smiled coldly. "Thought you could run away with that, huh?" she said, taking a step toward him. "You're not getting away that easy." Luca's pulse raced. He had no choice. He couldn't outrun her, not with the way the tunnel narrowed. And the others, his group, they needed him. "Give it back," she said, her voice low, dangerous. "You've got one chance to hand it over." Luca's mind raced, and for a moment he considered running in the other direction, back toward where he had come from. But that would only lead him straight into the others who were chasing him. The path ahead seemed impossible, a dead end. He had to think fast. He wasn't just running from these kids anymore. He was running from the desperation that had driven him to make this choice in the first place. The cold truth was, survival meant doing whatever it took. And that was the hardest part, knowing that he was willing to go to extremes to protect those he loved, even if it meant making enemies. The girl took another step toward him, and Luca's thoughts cleared, focusing on one thing: escape. There was a narrow ledge along the side of the tunnel that he had noticed earlier. It wasn't much, but it might be his only chance to outmaneuver her. With a burst of energy, Luca darted to the side, grabbing the ledge with his hands as he swung himself up. His heart pounded as he scrambled along the narrow path, the cold stone scraping against his palms. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He could hear the girl cursing, her footsteps pounding behind him, but he didn't stop. His mind was one step ahead, calculating his every move. The ledge curved, a slight turn that would take him further into the darkness, and hopefully out of sight. He rounded the corner quickly, barely keeping his footing. His hands were slick with sweat now, his breath coming in jagged gasps. But as he rounded the next corner, the tunnel opened up slightly, the shadows stretching longer ahead. He could hear the distant sounds of his pursuers, but they were farther away now. He had gained some ground. "Keep going. Don't stop." Luca pushed forward, adrenaline pumping through him. He didn't know how much farther he could go, but he couldn't slow down. He had to make it back to the others, back to safety. Finally, the tunnel began to widen, and he knew he was getting closer to the point where he had left the group. The familiar sounds of the fire flickering and the faint voices of Sarah and the others reached his ears. He took a deep breath and slowed slightly, his legs shaking with exhaustion. But then he heard something else, voices approaching fast, and they weren't from his group. Luca froze, his heart racing as his eyes scanned the shadows ahead. The chase wasn't over yet. Before he could react, a hand grabbed his arm, yanking him backward into the darkness. "Thought you could outrun us, huh?" Luca's heart sank as he realized what was happening. They had caught up to him, Jax's group, and this time they weren't just playing around. The real danger was here. "Where's the package?" One of them sneered, stepping into the light. Luca stood there, trapped, his mind whirling. He had no choice now. He could fight, but there were too many of them. He had made the wrong choice by coming here. "Give it to us, and maybe we'll let you walk away," the boy with the cruel grin said. Luca tightened his grip on the package, but deep down, he knew the fight wasn't worth it. He had to survive. They had to survive. With a quick glance at the shadows behind him, where he knew the others were waiting, Luca made a choice. The package wasn't worth their lives. He let go. The moment the package slipped from Luca's hands and hit the cold ground with a soft thud, everything seemed to freeze. The distant hum of the city above, the steady drip of water from the tunnel's walls, the thundering of his own heartbeat, all of it disappeared, leaving only a hollow emptiness in the space where his choice had been made. The boy with the cruel grin stepped forward, his eyes glinting as he reached down and snatched the package from the floor. "That's better," he said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Now we can all walk away without more trouble." Luca stood frozen, unable to move, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind was a blur, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he had just made. He had given them the package, but the cost felt like it would drown him. "You should be grateful," the boy sneered, holding the package high as if taunting Luca. "You're lucky we're letting you go. Not everyone gets that chance." Luca didn't respond. He couldn't. The reality of their situation was too sharp to reel. They had traded everything for a slim chance at survival, but it didn't feel like survival anymore. It felt like surrender. The group of older kids turned, preparing to leave, and Luca felt a rush of panic wash over him. What if they didn't come back? What if this was the end? But then something shifted, a movement in the shadows. At the far end of the tunnel, Just beyond the reach of the firelight, he saw them. The others. Sarah, Daniel, and Emily. They had stayed hidden, waiting, just as Luca had instructed. And as the older kids began to walk away with the package, Luca's chest tightened with both relief and fear. They had gotten what they needed, but at what cost? Luca stood there, his hands shaking, as the older kids disappeared into the darkness. The tunnel felt colder now, emptier. He had made a choice for the group, for their survival. But the guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder that no decision was ever truly without consequence. Is it over? Emily's voice broke through the silence, soft and uncertain. Luca turned to see her standing there, her small face pale in the dim light, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. He couldn't answer her. Right away, his throat felt tight, as if the words were caught somewhere deep inside him. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, it's over. For now." Emily didn't say anything else, but Luca could see the questions in her eyes, the same questions that swirled in his mind. Had they done the right thing? Had they made the right choice? They had the food, the supplies. But was it worth it? The cost? The price they had paid? Sarah, still half asleep, shifted in Luca's lap, her small hand reaching for his. "Are we going to be okay, Luca?" she asked in a sleepy whisper. Luca looked down at her, his heart heavy. He wanted to tell her the truth, that they would be okay, that things would get better. But that truth was elusive, slipping through his fingers like sand. "I don't know," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "But we're together, and we'll figure it out. We always do." He looked over at Daniel, who was watching him closely, as if waiting for some kind of answer too. But the truth was, Luca didn't have the answers. He didn't know how to make it better. He didn't know how to fix everything that had been broken, but he had made a promise to Sarah, to Daniel, to Emily. He would keep them safe, no matter what it took. "We'll keep moving forward," Luca continued, his voice growing steadier. "One step at a time. We'll find a way out of this." The others nodded, but Luca could see the weariness in their eyes. The road ahead was long. There were more choices to be made, more sacrifices, more moments of uncertainty. But for now, they were together, and that was enough. As they huddled together in the dim light of the tunnel, Luca felt something shift inside him, a small flicker of hope, like a flame in the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. For the first time in a long time, Luca allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for them. That despite everything they had lost, they could still find a way to survive. "We'll find our way," Luca said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "We'll make it through." The tunnels, once a dark labyrinth of uncertainty, now felt strangely comforting to Luca. The fire was out, the embers still glowing faintly in the corner, casting an orange hue over the cold walls. The weight of the night's events pressed on him like a heavy blanket, suffocating in its finality. They had made it out, for now, but at what cost? Luca sat cross-legged on the cold floor, his back leaning against the rough brick wall. His hands were still trembling from the adrenaline of the chase, the guilt from his decision settling deep in his bones. He had given away the package to save them, to keep them fed for a little while longer. But his mind kept circling back to the price he'd paid, the price of survival. It wasn't just the package. It was their trust. It was his own sense of self-worth. The things you did to survive, they had a way of changing you. Sarah was asleep in his lap again, her face peaceful despite the nightmare that had unfolded. Emily and Daniel sat a few feet away, the older boy staring out into the dark abyss of the tunnel, while Emily fidgeted nervously beside him. Luca wanted to sleep, wanted to rest and forget the weight of the night, but there was no escape. The night's events kept replaying in his mind, the chase, the older kids, and the nagging feeling that they hadn't escaped danger at all. They just walked deeper into it. The soft murmur of Sarah's breathing brought him back to the present. He stroked her hair gently, careful not to wake her. She was safe now, at least for a while. But Luca knew that safety was fleeting. "Luca!" Daniel's voice broke the silence, startling him slightly. Luca turned to face him, his chest tightening. Daniel was always quiet, always brooding, but there was something in his voice, now heaviness, an unspoken question. Luca shifted, making room for Daniel to sit beside him. He didn't need to ask. He could already tell what was on the boy's mind. "Did we make the right choice?" Daniel asked, his voice soft, filled with doubt. "Giving it to them. Was that the right thing?" Luca looked down at Sarah's sleeping form in his lap, his fingers still brushing through her hair. He didn't know the answer. The truth was, he felt like he'd made the best choice he could with the information he had. But that didn't make it feel any easier. The weight of their situation was sinking in, and the quiet moments like this made it even harder to ignore. "I don't know, Dan," Luca said quietly. "I don't know if there's a right choice down here. There's just survival. And sometimes you have to do things you never thought you'd do." Daniel's gaze didn't leave Luca's face. "But is it worth it? What's the point of surviving if we lose everything we are in the process?" Luca closed his eyes for a moment, thinking, what was the point? They had done what they had to in order to survive, but each step they took down this path seemed to cost them more and more. But there was still one thing left, one thing that kept him grounded: the others. They were his family now. Together, they had something that no one could take from them. "We're still here, Dan," Luca said, his voice firm, though he wasn't sure if he believed the words himself. "We're still alive, and that's something. We haven't lost each other. As long as we have that, we've got something worth fighting for." Daniel didn't answer right away, but Luca could see the conflict in his eyes. The boy was right to question, right to doubt. This wasn't the kind of world where answers were easy to find, but Luca had to believe that the fight was worth something, or else it wouldn't be worth fighting at all. The sound of footsteps interrupted their quiet moment, and Luca quickly turned, his heart skipping a beat. For a moment, his mind flashed to the older kids, to the danger that still lurked in the shadows. But when he looked up, it was Emily, standing at the edge of the firelight, her eyes wide with fear. "Luca, look," Emily whispered, pointing into the darkness. Luca stood up quickly, his protective instincts kicking in. He followed her gaze, straining his eyes to see what she had spotted. There, in the distance, barely visible in the dim light, were more figures' shapes moving toward them. A few of them were walking slowly, cautiously, as if they knew exactly where they were going. Luca's heart pounded, his mind raced. With possibilities, were they from Jax's group? Had they come back for revenge? But then something in his gut told him that this was different. These weren't the same kids. "We have to move," Luca said, his voice low and urgent. Now he grabbed Sarah, who was still half asleep, and lifted her into his arms. Emily and Daniel followed closely behind him as they hurried to a darker part of the tunnel, away from the approaching figures. Luca's breath came in sharp bursts as he moved quickly, his mind calculating their next steps. The last thing he wanted was to run again, to hide from something else they couldn't control. But they had no choice. The threat was real. He could feel it in his bones. They moved deeper into the maze of tunnels, the sounds of the approaching figures growing louder, but they didn't stop. Every step they took seemed to echo, every noise amplified in the stillness. Luca felt the weight of their situation settle in again, the familiar burden of responsibility pressing down on him. The tunnels seemed endless, twisting and turning, a maze that offered no clear path forward. Luca could barely see the others behind him, but he knew they were there, just as close to him as they ever had been. And that, at least, was something. After what felt like hours of moving through the darkness, Luca finally stopped, his breath ragged as he turned to face the others. They had reached a small alcove, hidden from view. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them out of sight for now. "We stay here for the night," Luca said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. "We'll figure out what to do in the morning." They all nodded, settling down on the cold stone floor, trying to find comfort in the darkness. Sarah curled up beside Luca again, her small body shivering as she sought warmth. Daniel leaned against the wall, his face unreadable, and Emily sat near them, clutching her bear tightly. Luca sat up against the wall, his mind still racing. He had kept them safe for one more night, but the journey ahead was uncertain. There would be more dangers, more choices, more sacrifices. But for now, they were together, and that was all that mattered. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the next challenge. But for tonight, they could rest. Tomorrow, they would face it together. The night in the alcove passed in uneasy silence, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words and the lingering tension of the chase. Luca lay against the cold stone wall, staring into the blackness above, unable to shake the images of the night before. The faces of the older kids, the cruel way they had taunted him, the way the package had slipped from his hands, it all replayed in his mind, as though he were still running, still fighting, still trying to make the right decision. Beside him, Sarah slept fitfully, her small form curled up for warmth. Every now and then, she would stir, her face contorting in distress, as though she too could feel the weight of their uncertain future. Luca reached over, gently brushing a strand of her hair from her face. She was so young, so innocent, and it tore at his heart, knowing what she had already been through. Emily was sitting against the wall, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes wide and alert even in the dim light. She was always the one who seemed to feel the pulse of danger first, the one who noticed the things others missed. She was so small, but there was something about her that seemed to carry the world's weight on her shoulders, as though she was already preparing for whatever came next. Daniel, as always, was quiet. His eyes were closed, but Luca could sense the tension in his body, the way he held himself as though bracing for something. Luca had noticed it before. Daniel wasn't just physically weary. The boy carried a deeper kind of exhaustion, one that went beyond the hunger and the cold. "How are we going to make it, Luca?" Emily's voice broke the silence, her tone soft, but heavy with fear. She wasn't looking at him, but the question still hit him like a physical blow. Luca swallowed hard, trying to keep the panic from rising in his chest. The truth was, he didn't know. He didn't have all the answers. And the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like no one did. Survival in the streets wasn't about certainty. It was about luck, about quick thinking, and about doing whatever it took to make it through the next hour, the next day. "I don't know, Luca said, his voice quiet, "but we have each other, and that counts for something. We'll keep moving. We'll figure it out." Emily's eyes met his, her brow furrowed with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "But what if? What if we don't?" Luca's heart clenched at the thought. He couldn't let her think that way. He couldn't let any of them think that way. But how could he promise them something he didn't know he could deliver? "We will," he said firmly, even though the words didn't feel true. "We have to. We don't have a choice." The silence returned, heavy and thick, as the four of them sat there in the darkness, trying to find solace in each other's presence. They couldn't change the world outside. They couldn't fix the broken system that had abandoned them, but they had one another. And in a world that felt like it had no place for them, that had to be enough. The night stretched on, the sound of dripping water in the distance lulling Luca into a light sleep, though it never felt like true rest. His mind wandered back to their journey, everything they had lost, everything they had survived, and to the road that still lay ahead. He had made promises to them. He had promised that they would survive, that he would keep them safe. But the road ahead was long, and they were so small, so fragile in a world that only seemed to grow harsher. But as his eyes flickered open, and he glanced down at the children sleeping around him, he realized something. They were still here. Despite everything, they were still fighting. And that meant something. Luca's thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of voices in the distance. He tensed immediately, his instincts kicking in. His head snapped toward the others, his gaze darting to where they had hidden in the alcove. He signaled for them to be silent, his hand outstretched to stop any movement. The voices grew louder, and Luca could feel his heart rate spike. "They're coming," he whispered, urgent. "Stay low." He stood slowly, making sure not to wake Sarah, who was still curled up at his side. He motioned for Daniel and Emily to follow him, and the three of them moved as quietly as possible, sliding deeper into the shadows of the tunnel. They had to stay out of sight. The last thing they needed now was another encounter with the older kids. They couldn't afford another fight, not when they were already so close to the edge. Luca pressed his back to the wall, listening intently. The voices grew louder still, but the figures didn't seem to notice them. They were still too far away for Luca to make out any details, but the tension in his body remained. Whoever they were getting closer. "Keep moving," Luca whispered, taking a few cautious steps back, urging the others to follow. "We need to stay hidden." They continued down the narrow corridor, moving as silently as possible. Every step seemed to echo in the silence, every footfall magnified in the oppressive darkness. It felt like the walls were closing in on them, and Luca's mind raced with questions. Who were these people? Why were they coming this way? And what did they want? Luca's pulse quickened as the figures drew nearer, but as they rounded a bend in the tunnel, the voices suddenly stopped. The sounds of movement ceased, leaving an eerie stillness hanging in the air. Luca froze, his breath caught in his throat. What was happening? And then, from the darkness ahead, a figure stepped forward. Luca's heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows, their face partially obscured by the hood of their jacket. They stepped into the small sliver of light, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Luca didn't know whether to run or hide, but the figure didn't move toward them. Instead, they spoke. "You're lost," the figure said, their voice low and gravelly. "You're all lost." Luca's breath hitched. He didn't know whether to speak, to ask what this person wanted, or to run. But before he could make up his mind, the figure continued. "Don't worry," the voice said, almost reassuringly. "I'm not here to hurt you, but you're not safe down here. Not for long." Luca's mind spun, but the stranger didn't wait for a response. "You'll need more than what you've got to survive, and I can help you, but you'll have to trust me." Luca's body tensed. This was exactly what they didn't need. Another risk, another choice to make. But something in the stranger's voice, something about the way they spoke, made Luca hesitate. "Who are you?" Luca finally managed to ask. The stranger's head tilted slightly, as if considering the question. Then, with a slight smile, they said one word. "A friend." The stranger's words hung in the air, thick with suspicion and uncertainty. Luca's heart raced as he tried to assess the figure before him. They stood there, cloaked in the shadows, their face still obscured by the hood of their jacket. The voice had been calm, almost reassuring, but there was a coldness to it. It's something that made Luca's instincts scream for him to turn and run. "A friend?" Luca asked, his voice tight. "How do we know we can trust you?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, they stepped closer, just enough to reveal more of their face, a young man, perhaps in his 20s, with dark eyes that seemed to gleam with knowledge, or perhaps just experience. His expression was unreadable, like a mask hiding something deeper. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man said again, though. His words did little to ease the tension in Luca's chest. "But you're not going to make it down here without help. Not for long. The city eats people alive, and you're not equipped to survive on your own." Luca stood frozen, his mind racing. Was this a trap? Another kid looking to take advantage of their situation? Or could this person actually be offering them a way out? A way to survive? Behind him, he could feel Emily, Daniel, and Sarah watching, waiting for him to make the next move. Luca's pulse pounded in his ears. They had already trusted too many people, had already risked too much. But the stranger's words kept echoing in his mind. "You're not equipped to survive on your own." They weren't ready. They didn't know enough to fight back against the dangers of the streets, and every step they took felt like a risk. Maybe, just maybe, this person was the lifeline they needed. Luca took a cautious step forward, his eyes never leaving the stranger. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm of uncertainty inside him. "Why are you offering help?" The man tilted his head, his dark eyes flicking over the group before returning to Luca. "I don't want anything from you. I just know what it's like out here, and I know how quickly things can go wrong. You're trying to survive, but you're doing it blind. I can teach you how to do better, how to stay alive longer." Luca's breath caught in his throat. Stay alive longer. That's what they had been trying to do, wasn't it? But was this man truly offering a way out, or was he just another person with their own agenda, waiting to exploit their weakness? "I don't know you," Luca said, his voice cautious. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" The stranger smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "You don't, but you will. You'll see soon enough." He shifted, his movements smooth, almost practiced. "I can get you what you need. I know this city better than anyone. I can show you where the food is, where the shelter is, and more important, where the people who can hurt you are." Luca's stomach twisted at the thought. They were always running, always hiding, but they were getting nowhere. They were always so close to making it, only to find another dead end. A part of him, the part that wanted to protect the others more than anything, wanted to trust this man, to take him at his word. But another part of him, the part that had learned to be cautious, screamed at him to walk away, to run before they found themselves in an even worse situation. Why would you help us? Daniel's voice cut through the silence, a low murmur that held more curiosity than fear. Luca turned to look at him, his eyes searching the boy's face. He could see the same uncertainty in Daniel that Luca felt, but there was something else there too, a glimmer of hope, a desperate longing for something that resembled safety. The stranger turned his gaze to Daniel, his expression unreadable. Because I know what it's like to be in your shoes. I've been there. I know what it's like to have nothing, to have no one. I've learned to survive, and now I want to help others do the same. No one else will. People like you end up forgotten, or worse. Luca's thoughts spun. This could be their way out, or their undoing. There was something about the man's words, the way he spoke with certainty, that felt real. But everything in Luca's gut told him that trust didn't come easily. What do you want in return? Luca asked, his voice firm, wanting to hear the cost. There had to be a catch. There was always a catch. The man's eyes flickered to the small group behind Luca, then back to him. I'm not asking for much. I need something from you, yes. But it's not what you think. He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. I need you to trust me, just long enough to get you through the first few days. After that, you're free to go. No strings attached. You can walk away if you don't like it. But I promise you, it'll be better than anything you can do alone. Luca felt the weight of his decision settling in. There was a chance this man was telling the truth, but there was also the possibility that they were walking into another trap. He needed to think. He needed to protect the others, to make the right decision for them. But the reality was, they didn't have many choices left. Luca turned to Emily, Daniel, and Sarah. They were all waiting for him, there, eyes filled with uncertainty. He could see the fear, but he could also see something else, hope. Hope that, for once, someone might actually be offering them a way out. Luca's heart pounded as he met their gazes. This was the hardest decision he had ever made. He couldn't make it alone. They were in this together. All right, Luca said finally, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of his choice. We'll trust you, but if this turns out to be a trick, we're gone. Understand? The stranger nodded, his smile returning though still without warmth. Understood. Luca stood taller, his back straight. This was their best shot. They had no choice but to take it. They had to trust. We'll follow you, Luca said, turning back to the others. But stay close. We can't afford to lose each other. With that, they followed the stranger into the dark unknown, the weight of the city's cold streets pressing in around them. They had made a choice, and for better or worse, they would see it through. The stranger led them through the winding tunnels, his pace steady and measured. With every step, Luca's instincts fought with the uncertainty in his chest. There was something unnerving about the calmness with which the stranger moved, like he was completely at ease in the dark labyrinth of the city's underbelly. But Luca didn't have the luxury of questioning everything. Not now. The group followed closely behind, trying to keep as quiet as possible, their footsteps echoing softly in the damp air. Luca glanced at the others. Sarah, still clinging to him, was silent, her face pale from exhaustion. Emily and Daniel were close, their eyes wide with both curiosity and fear. They didn't know who this man was, didn't know if he could be trusted, but they had no other option. The tunnel ahead stretched endlessly, a maze of concrete and rusted metal that seemed to go on forever. The flickering light from a distant bulb barely illuminated the path, casting long, shifting shadows that made the air feel thick and oppressive. The stranger didn't speak for a long while, and Luca didn't know whether it was because he preferred silence or because he was waiting for them to make the first move. Either way, the quiet was heavy, almost suffocating. Finally, Luca couldn't take it anymore. Where are we going? He asked, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. The stranger glanced back, his dark eyes meeting Luca's with an unreadable expression. I told you, you need to know where to go. I'm showing you the way. Luca's mind raced. It was vague, and that worried him. He needed more details, specifics. They couldn't afford to blindly trust anyone, no matter how convincing they seemed. And what exactly are we getting? Where's the food? The shelter? The stranger's lips curled slightly, almost as if he were amused. Everything in time. The city doesn't give you what you need immediately. You have to earn it, find it. But I can show you where the first step is. Where the real survival starts. Luca swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him, suffocating. They had agreed to trust this man, but how long would that trust last? Would it be enough to keep them safe? Could they afford to gamble their future on someone they barely knew? They walked for what felt like hours, the tunnels twisting and turning in ways that made it impossible for Luca to remember the path they had taken. He tried to keep track, marking every turn in his mind, but it was getting harder. The stranger, however, seemed to know exactly where he was going. He never hesitated, never looked back. Finally, they reached a narrow passage where the air smelled musty and damp, but there was something different about it, a faint warmth that Luca hadn't noticed before. The stranger paused, turning back to face the group. "This is where you start," he said, his voice low and serious. "I'll be waiting. Do what you have to do." Luca narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" The stranger didn't respond immediately. He stepped aside, gesturing for them to move forward. "You'll find out soon enough. This is where the rules change. It's not just about surviving. It's about what you're willing to do to make it. I'll be back for you. Don't make me wait too long." Before Luca could ask any more questions, the stranger turned and walked back the way they had come, disappearing into the dark, just as quietly as he had appeared. Luca stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. The others were looking at him, waiting for direction. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, while Emily's gaze darted around nervously. Daniel's expression was unreadable, but Luca could sense the quiet tension in his body. "What now?" Emily asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Luca exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the unknown settle in his chest. "We move forward. We have to trust that he's telling the truth." Daniel glanced at him, his eyes dark. "I don't trust him, Luca. I don't trust anyone down here." Luca nodded. He felt the same way, but they didn't have any other choice. Not now. They had come this far, and it was too late to turn back. They had to keep going. With a deep breath, Luca stepped forward, leading the group into the narrow passage. The walls were damp and uneven, and the floor was littered with scraps of old metal and debris. As they walked, the air grew warmer, and Luca could hear the distant sound of water dripping, echoing off the walls. The passage seemed to stretch on forever, but Luca kept moving forward, his mind focused on the steps ahead. Every so often, he glanced back to make sure the others were still behind him. Sarah's small hand was clutching his, her fingers cold, but she didn't let go. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached a large chamber. It was dark, but the faint light of a few distant torches flickered on the walls, casting long shadows across the floor. In the center of the room stood a few crates, some stacked high, others toppled over, their contents spilling onto the ground. Luca felt the air shift, the weight of something unfamiliar settling in. It was a place meant for survival, but at what cost? The walls seemed to close in as they stepped deeper into the chamber, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. There were no signs of life here, no signs of anyone else, just the remnants of whatever had once been. Luca's breath caught in his throat as he saw something in the corner, a door, barely visible, but it was there. He could feel it, that nagging sense of urgency, pulling him toward it. "We have to get inside," Luca muttered, barely more than a whisper. "Why?" Emily asked, her voice tight with fear. "What's behind there?" Luca didn't know, but whatever it was their next step. Luca nodded, his heart pounding. He didn't have answers. He didn't have the comfort of certainty, but he had no other choice. With a deep breath, Luca moved toward the door, the others following closely behind. There was no going back now, no more hesitation. They were in this together, no matter what came next. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the unknown waiting beyond. The door creaked open with a groan, the sound reverberating through the stillness of the chamber. Luca stepped forward, his heart racing in his chest. The others closed behind him. The darkness beyond the door seemed to swallow the little light that filtered through the room, creating an almost impenetrable void. For a moment, all they could do was stand there, suspended in time, the weight of what they were about to face hanging heavily in the air. Luca's mind raced with questions. What was behind that door? What kind of place had the stranger led them to? He felt a strange combination of dread and anticipation. They had no idea where they were, and every step they took deeper into the unknown seemed more dangerous than the last. "Luca, are you sure about this?" Daniel asked, his voice low and laced with uncertainty. Luca turned to look at him. He could see the fear in Daniel's eyes, the same fear that gnawed at his own insides. He didn't have an answer, not really, but they couldn't keep running. They couldn't keep hiding forever. If they had any hope of making it out of this city, they needed to take risks. "I don't know what's on the other side," Luca said, his voice steady despite the storm of doubt raging inside him. "But we need to know. We can't just keep surviving like this. We have to try." Emily moved closer, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. "What if it's a trap?" "It might be," Luca admitted, "but what choice do we have? We've already trusted strangers before. If we don't take chances, we'll never get out of here." Sarah, still clutching his hand, looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. She didn't understand everything that had happened to them, but Luca could see the trust in her face. They were all counting on him to make the right decision. He pushed the door open slowly, the heavy wood creaking as it gave way. As the door swung open, a strange, low light filled the space, flickering like candle flames in the distance. The room beyond was vast, but it was difficult to make out the details at first. The air was different here, thick with the scent of something unfamiliar, perhaps old stone and earth, mingling with a faint smell of decay. Luca hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The others followed suit, one by one, as they moved into the dimly lit space. Their footsteps echoed off the stone floor, amplifying their presence in the otherwise silent room. In the center of the chamber stood a large table cluttered with various objects, books, maps, old weapons, and strange tools that Luca didn't recognize. The walls were lined with shelves, and a few flickering lanterns provided just enough light to reveal the thick layers of dust that covered everything. The room felt abandoned, forgotten by time. Luca's eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of life. He didn't trust the silence. Everything in him screamed that they weren't alone. And then, from the far corner of the room, a figure emerged. The figure was tall, their face hidden in the shadows, but Luca could feel their gaze fixed on it. "The stranger. You came." The stranger's voice echoed in the silence, its tone low but confident. "I wasn't sure if you would." Luca's heart skipped a beat. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice demanding an explanation. "What's behind all of this?" The stranger stepped closer, the soft shuffle of their feet the only sound in the stillness. "This is a place where people like you learn what it takes to survive. It's a place where you learn the truth about the world you're living in." Luca 10. "And what's that truth?" The stranger smiled, though it was a smile full of something dark and knowing. "The truth is that there are two ways to survive in this world. You can live in fear, constantly running, hiding, and hoping someone will save you. Or you can take control. You can make the world bend to your will." Luca felt a cold shiver run down his spine. What was the stranger trying to say? Was this some kind of test? Some cruel game they were being dragged into? The stranger stepped forward, his presence imposing, and for the first time, Luca saw the full extent of the man's face. His eyes were sharp, calculating eyes that had seen too much, eyes that knew the price of survival. "You have a choice," the stranger said, his voice carrying a weight that settled deep into Luca's chest. "You can take what I'm offering, learn how to fight for what you need, or you can walk away and keep hiding. You can stay the way you are, weak, struggling, always just one step away from falling, or you can be something more." Luca's mind spun. What was he asking? Was the stranger offering them power, control? Was this a chance for them to stop being victims, to finally stand up and take charge of their lives? The stranger's eyes flickered to Daniel, to Emily, to Sarah. "But remember," the man continued, his tone colder now, "there is no going back. Once you choose, there's no turning away from the path. The city will break you if you let it, or it will bend to your will if you're strong enough." Luca's heart raced. The choice lay before him, heavy and final. Could he trust this stranger? Could he trust what the man was offering? The thought of taking control, of being strong enough to survive, to protect his family, his group, was tempting. But at what cost? Luca looked at Sarah, her eyes full of innocent trust, then to Daniel and Emily, both of whom were waiting for his lead. He couldn't make this decision alone. They were all in this together. "What do you want from us?" Luca finally asked, his voice steady. The stranger's smile deepened, almost a smirk. "I don't want anything from you. What you choose will be yours. But make no mistake, everything you do from here on out will define who you are. It will change everything." Luca swallowed, his chest tight with the gravity of the moment. He glanced at the others, their eyes filled with questions, fears, and hopes. This was their chance to make something of themselves, to survive. But was it worth it? Luca stepped forward, his decision made. "We'll take the chance." The stranger's smile widened, as if he had been waiting for that answer. "Good," he said simply. "Then let's begin." And with that, the door behind them slammed shut. Hope you enjoyed the story. Comment where you're watching from, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel.